Western Front, France, 1917. The mathematics of death were brutally simple. Artillery pounded enemy trenches before an assault, shells screaming overhead, earth erupting in geysers of mud and shattered timber, defenders cowering in their dugouts 30 feet underground. For hours, sometimes days, the bombardment would continue. Then, silence. That silence was the killing ground. The artillery had to stop before friendly troops went over the top. You couldn't shell your own men as they advanced. But in those critical minutes between when the last shell fell and when attacking soldiers reached the enemy trench, German machine gunners would scramble up from their dugouts. They'd drag their Maxims into position, feed in ammunition belts, and open fire across no man's land. Wave after wave of men fell in that gap, thousands at a time. The machine guns cut them down like wheat before a scythe, their bodies piling up on barbed wire, disappearing into shell craters filled with muddy water and blood. Traditional infantry tactics made it worse. Fire and movement, where half your unit shoots while the other half advances, slowed everything to a crawl. You had fewer men shooting at any given moment, giving defenders more time to kill you. And every second you spent crossing that open ground was another second in the machine gun's sights. What the armies desperately needed was a way to keep continuous, devastating fire on the enemy while every man in the assault line moved forward together. Not half the unit shooting while half advanced, everyone advancing, everyone shooting, overwhelming firepower in motion. The French thought they'd found the answer. The Chauchat looked like salvation when it first appeared. Here was a weapon light enough for one man to carry, automatic enough to lay down suppressive fire, mobile enough to advance with the assault troops. French infantry used them as roving machine gun hunters, teams that would charge enemy positions with grenades and automatic fire, seeking out the guns that were slaughtering their comrades. The concept was revolutionary. The execution was catastrophic. Firing the Chauchat from the hip, which was how you were supposed to use it while advancing, felt like wrestling an angry animal. Its long recoil system produced a violently uneven kick that fought against the shooter with every burst. External parts snagged on uniforms, equipment, anything within reach. Mud jammed the mechanism. Magazines failed. American troops who received versions converted to .30-06 discovered reliability so poor the weapons were practically useless. So the concept was proven, but the weapon was wrong. Someone needed to build it right. And in 1917, that job went to a man who'd already revolutionized firearms half a dozen times over, John Moses Browning.
Browning's vision was precise and uncompromising. The weapon had to be man-portable, chambered in the full-power .30-06 cartridge, capable of both semi-automatic and fully automatic fire, reliable under the worst battlefield conditions imaginable, and fed from a magazine substantially larger than the standard 5-round service rifle. The magazine capacity settled at 20 rounds, a compromise that avoided the bulk of 40-round magazines that made prone firing nearly impossible. But it was the tactical concept behind the weapon that mattered most. This wasn't a light machine gun for static defensive positions. This was a weapon designed specifically for something the Army called walking fire. Here's how it was supposed to work. Soldiers equipped with bars would advance on an enemy position, firing mainly from the hip in semi-automatic mode. You weren't trying to pick off individual targets, not yet. You were trying to generate enough fire to keep every German defender's head down, pin them in their trenches, make them too terrified to look over the parapet, too busy ducking to aim their own weapons. Create a moving wall of bullets that suppressed the enemy, while your assault line closed the distance.
Then, at very close range, when you could see the whites of their eyes, when you were almost on top of the trench, the selector would flip to full automatic, short, devastating bursts during the final rush, and in the savage close quarters fighting that followed, when you were in the trench itself, that automatic fire could clear a position in seconds. The fire selector design reveals how seriously Browning took this concept. He made it deliberately stiff, requiring real effort to move, often needing 2 fingers or even both hands. It moved from safe, closest to the shooter, forward to semi-automatic, then forward again to full auto. Moving from semi to auto was easy, aided by a spring-loaded stop, but getting back to safe required deliberate force. Browning understood combat psychology. A soldier switching modes under fire, hands slick with sweat or blood, adrenaline screaming through his veins, couldn't accidentally flip the selector to safe and find his rifle dead when he needed it most. Better a weapon that required effort to make safe than one that could fail you with an accidental touch in the middle of a firefight. At 16 pounds, the BAR was substantially lighter than the 20-plus pound Lewis gun. That difference mattered enormously because shoulder firing was part of the design. You couldn't realistically fire a Lewis from the shoulder, but the BAR was meant for precisely that when the tactical situation demanded aimed shots at range. The sights, borrowed directly from the excellent M1917 Enfield rifle with its superb rear aperture peep sight system, allowed for accurate shooting at distance when needed. Production became its own battlefield. 3 companies, Colt, Winchester, and Marlin, fought over contracts. Disputes erupted, delays mounted. At one point, Browning himself refused to attend Winchester demonstrations of his own design, still angry over earlier conflicts. By war's end, roughly 52,000 M1918 BARs existed, with about 48,000 shipped overseas before the armistice.
By summer 1918, BARs were arriving in France by the thousands. At least 17,000 had reached the country by the end of July. American units desperately wanted them. Training officers pleaded for them. Frontline troops, still struggling with unreliable Shosha, begged for them. General Pershing said no. Not because the weapon wasn't ready, not because troops weren't trained, but because he was playing a longer, darker game. Pershing believed the war would continue well into 1919. Spring offensives were already being planned on both sides, and he had a weapon that could potentially change the entire character of infantry assault, but only if the Germans didn't know about it. Every weapon introduced to combat piecemeal risked capture. A single BAR in German hands would be disassembled, studied, potentially copied. German factories were remarkably skilled at reverse engineering captured weapons. Pershing refused to squander his advantage by letting the BAR trickle into combat, where German patrols might capture examples before America could field it in decisive numbers. His plan was to wait, hold them back, then unleash the BAR in massive numbers all at once, equipping entire divisions simultaneously rather than scattering them across the front. Hit the Germans with thousands of automatic rifles in a single coordinated offensive, overwhelming them before they could adapt. So the BARs piled up in reserve depots, while American soldiers continued dying with inferior weapons in their hands. Finally, on September 13, 1918, Pershing authorized combat use. The first BARs went into action on September 22nd, just before the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the massive final push that would eventually help end the war.
Initial combat reports described a weapon that performed like nothing German defenders had encountered before. Easier to handle than the Shosha, which wasn't saying much, but genuinely effective in ways the French weapon had never been. Soldiers fired it from the hip while advancing, exactly as Browning intended. The full-power 30-06 rounds punched through obstacles that would stop pistol-caliber submachine gun rounds cold. Because engagements remained fairly limited before the armistice, early field tests often measured durability rather than combat effectiveness. How well did the weapon hold up under marching, mud, neglect, and minimal cleaning? The data proved remarkable. Where 400 Shoshas were abandoned during operations, broken down, jammed, too unreliable to fix under fire, only 72 bars suffered the same fate. The weapon even came with dedicated web gear recognizing its unique role. 3 different belt configurations existed, one for the gunner, one for the first assistant, one for the second assistant. The gunner's belt was particularly telling. It included a metal cup mounted on the right side, designed specifically to support the bar's buttstock during walking fire. This wasn't improvised. This wasn't soldiers figuring things out in the field. Hip firing while advancing was official doctrine, baked into the equipment design from the beginning. From the first encounters, German soldiers reacted with something between shock and terror. American units reported capturing prisoners who seemed psychologically broken by the new weapon, men too shaken by the volume and violence of automatic rifle fire to keep fighting. The distinctive sound alone was unprecedented, not the rapid chatter of a machine gun, but something heavier, more deliberate, more personal. Individual riflemen advancing while firing full-power cartridges automatically. The armistice on November 11, 1918, cut short the period when the weapon might have fully proven Pershing's gambit. The massive spring 1919 offensives never happened, but seeds of the weapon's fearsome reputation had been planted deep in German military consciousness. They would remember.
America, 1920s to 1930s. When World War I ended, 52,000 M1918 Browning automatic rifles sat in military depots and National Guard armories across America. Part-time facilities, minimal security, weekend warriors in charge of weapons designed to suppress enemy trenches. During Prohibition's most violent years, America's most notorious criminals saw an opportunity. Clyde Barrow didn't just use the BAR, he made it his signature. He preferred it over the more famous Thompson submachine gun for one simple, deadly reason. The 30-06 cartridge could punch completely through the thick steel doors and fenders of 1930s automobiles. The Thompson's .45 ACP pistol round couldn't do that reliably. When police took cover behind their vehicles during shootouts, Clyde's BAR turned those cars into death traps rather than protective shields. On July 7, 1933, Clyde and his brother Buck broke into a National Guard armory in Enid, Oklahoma. They walked out with 5 BARs, 46 Colt .45 pistols, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. No one stopped them. Security was essentially non-existent. Clyde didn't just steal the weapons, he modified them. He cut down the barrel and gas tube, chopped the stock just behind the pistol grip, and welded 3 20-round magazines together to create crude 60-round assemblies. He was essentially building makeshift versions of what Colt would later sell commercially as the Monitor. These modified BARs became extraordinarily lethal in close-quarters combat. The Barrow Gang's firepower was devastating against law enforcement equipped with revolvers and shotguns, weapons utterly outmatched in range, rate of fire, and penetrating power. At a shootout in Joplin, Missouri in 1933, Bonnie Parker laid down covering fire with a BAR while the gang killed 2 lawmen and escaped. One highway patrol sergeant later recalled his terror. The little red-headed woman filled my face with splinters on the other side of that tree with one of those guns. The splinters came from the tree he was hiding behind. The BAR rounds were chewing through the trunk itself. When Bonnie and Clyde were finally ambushed and killed in May 1934, their car contained 3 full-automatic BARs and 100 loaded 20-round magazines, 2,000 rounds of .30-06 ammunition ready to fire. They'd been preparing for a battle, not a chase. This violence, along with the broader gangster warfare of the Prohibition era, led directly to the National Firearms Act of 1934. The law imposed a $200 tax on machine guns. In 1934 dollars, that came out to roughly $4,700 in today's money. The amount was deliberately set high enough that most American citizens could never afford it. The intent was clear: price automatic weapons out of civilian hands. Meanwhile, Colt responded to law enforcement's desperate need for equivalent firepower by developing the R80 Monitor specifically for police use. With an 18-inch barrel, it weighed just 14 pounds, lighter and more maneuverable than the military version, designed for officers who needed to match the firepower of criminals armed with stolen military hardware. But by the late 1930s, a larger shadow was falling across the world. Another war was coming, and the BAR was about to return to its original purpose: terrifying soldiers on European battlefields.
1938. War was inevitable. Everyone could see it coming. The U.S. Army decided the BAR needed updating for modern combat. What happened next was a case study in how bureaucrats can ruin a weapon designed by someone who actually understood warfare. The M1918A2, adopted in 1938, represented a fundamental philosophical shift. The Army decided to turn the BAR from an automatic rifle into a light machine gun. They got rid of semi-automatic fire entirely. In its place, 2 automatic rates of fire, slow at 300 to 450 rounds per minute using a hydraulic buffer, and fast at 500 to 650 rounds per minute. The rate reducer, the mechanism that created the slow rate of fire, was a complicated device that required constant cleaning. In combat conditions, where soldiers were lucky to find time to clean their weapons every few days, it jammed regularly. The very mechanism meant to make the weapon more controllable often rendered it useless. Then they added weight, lots of it. The original 16-pound design grew to nearly 20 pounds once they bolted on a bipod, flash suppressor, and hinged buttstock monopod. The excellent World War I-era rear aperture sight, genuinely good for aimed shooting, got replaced with a different arrangement that many soldiers found inferior. The buttstock was reshaped specifically for prone firing because the Army was trying to turn this weapon into something it was never meant to be. The bipod alone added nearly 3 pounds, and because it mounted at the muzzle, it actually caused barrel flex that degraded accuracy. Many soldiers found it more hindrance than help. But the biggest problem, the fundamental flaw that made the BAR inferior to true light machine guns, was the fixed barrel. Unlike the British Bren or the German MG-34 or MG-42, American BAR gunners couldn't swap out overheated barrels during sustained fire. Accuracy deteriorated badly after prolonged shooting, and the only solution was limiting yourself to controlled bursts and letting the barrel cool between engagements. The truly maddening part? Fabrique Nationale in Belgium had offered the U.S. Army their quick-change barrel design and improved rate reducer back in 1938-1939. The Belgian military was already using these improvements successfully. The U.S. Army turned them down because the modifications wouldn't work with existing M1918 receivers. Rather than build new receivers with better capabilities, the Army chose backwards compatibility with a design from 1918. They prioritized not wasting old parts over giving soldiers a weapon that might keep them alive. So what did soldiers actually do with all these improvements once they reached combat zones? They threw them away.
Lieutenant Colonel John George wrote that 2 weeks after his unit landed on Guadalcanal, they'd thrown away all the gadgets, including the bipod, and were using the guns stark naked, the way old John Browning had built them in the first place. Soldiers in combat, men whose lives depended on their weapons, stripped off the Army's improvements and went back to Browning's original concept. That should have told the brass everything they needed to know.
World War II, 1941 to 1945. About 190,000 BARs were produced for World War II. Training doctrine made it the squad's only automatic weapon, operated by a 3-man team: gunner, assistant gunner, and ammunition bearer. The gunner carried 220 rounds in 11 20-round magazines. The assistant carried additional magazines and stood ready to take over. Take over when, not if, when. Every member of the squad received basic BAR training because the Army expected, assumed, planned for designated gunners to become casualties. The BAR was the most dangerous weapon to carry for one simple tactical reason. Eliminating that single weapon meant the entire squad's ability to lay down suppressive fire dropped catastrophically. German intelligence reports were explicit. In all infantry engagements, the enemy constantly gave priority attention to the BAR in the squad. Every Wehrmacht soldier who spotted an American patrol knew exactly who to shoot first: the man with the BAR, always. Statistical analysis produced the estimate that gave this story its name: 30 minutes of life expectancy for a BAR gunner once combat began. Some lasted longer, many lasted less. The number was an average across thousands of engagements, thousands of dead men. Germans didn't just prioritize killing BAR gunners, they captured BARs whenever possible and put them into service themselves. They also continued using approximately 20,000 Polish-manufactured BARs seized during the 1939 invasion, employing them right through to the war's end in 1945. Context matters here. The vast majority of German soldiers carried Kar-98 bolt-action rifles, weapons from the previous war. Advanced firearms like the STG-44 or FG-42 existed in much smaller numbers. Only about 7,000 FG-42s were built. The STG-44 reached a couple 100,000, but the bolt-action Kar-98 saw over 14 million produced. German squad tactics were built around their MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns, truly devastating weapons with quick-change barrels and belt-fed operation. Riflemen existed mainly to support and protect the machine gun crew. Those machine guns significantly outgunned the BAR in sustained automatic fire, but the BAR, in turn, could outgun several German soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles. It was a weapon caught between worlds, too heavy to be a rifle, too limited to a true machine gun. But in the hands of determined men, it became something more than the sum of its specifications.
Charles de Glopper, 82nd Airborne, Normandy, June 1944. His platoon was trapped. German fire from multiple positions had them pinned down in a kill zone. They faced complete annihilation within minutes. De Glopper understood the mathematics of the situation with perfect clarity. Someone had to provide covering fire for the others to escape. That someone would die. There was no question about that, no uncertainty. The only question was who would make the choice. De Glopper made it. He stepped out of cover and knelt in the middle of the road, completely exposed. He opened fire with his BAR, aiming to suppress every German position simultaneously, giving his squad the seconds they needed to withdraw. Bullets hit him almost immediately. He kept firing. Blood soaked through his uniform. He kept firing, burst after burst, methodical, deliberate, giving his men time to live by spending the last seconds of his own life.
When his comrades returned after the fighting moved on, they found de Glopper's body surrounded by dead Germans and destroyed automatic weapons. He died as expected, but he'd taken enough of the enemy with him that his squad survived. He became the only soldier from the 82nd Airborne to receive the Medal of Honor during the Normandy campaign. Wilson Watson, 3rd Marine Division, Iwo Jima, February 1945. Over 2 days of fighting on Iwo Jima, Watson killed 60 Japanese soldiers. 60, not with artillery or grenades or naval gunfire, with his BAR, firing from the hip while charging pillboxes in exactly the way John Browning had originally imagined walking fire would work. He climbed jagged volcanic slopes under heavy fire from multiple fortified positions. Japanese defenders poured machine gun fire and rifle rounds at him as he advanced, but Watson kept moving forward, firing controlled bursts, suppressing position after position. He reached the top of a crucial ridge and held that ground alone for 15 minutes, an eternity in combat, until his ammunition was completely exhausted. When his comrades returned after the fighting moved on, they found Watson's body surrounded by dead Germans and destroyed automatic weapons. He died as expected, but he'd taken enough of the enemy with him that his squad survived. He became the only soldier from the 82nd Airborne to receive the Medal of Honor during the Normandy campaign. Henry Schauer, 3rd Infantry Division, Italy, 1944. What Schauer accomplished was called, by men who witnessed it, the greatest shooting performance with a BAR in the entire war. During fighting in Italy, he walked 30 yards straight toward enemy fire, didn't run, didn't seek cover, just walked forward calmly while 4 German riflemen were actively shooting at him. He stopped, took aim, killed all 4 Germans with 4 separate bursts at different ranges, different positions, different elevations, each burst precise and economical. Then he spotted 2 machine gunners at 60 yards, single burst, both down. Then 4 more Germans at 500 yards, extreme range for automatic rifle fire. He dropped all 4 with accurate, controlled shooting that should have been impossible with a weapon firing full-power rifle cartridges automatically. The next day, he wiped out a 4-man machine gun crew at 80 yards while tank shells were landing within 20 yards of where he stood. The concussion alone from those explosions should have thrown off his aim. He killed them anyway. His fellow soldiers called him Shooter. The name was reverent. These were exceptional men, but the BAR saw use across every theater of the war, in conditions that tested both the weapon and the men who carried it. In Normandy's Bocage country, that nightmare maze of hedgerows that turned France into a landscape of tiny killing zones, the BAR proved essential. Visibility rarely exceeded 100 meters. Ambushes came from behind every hedge. The ability to immediately lay down devastating automatic fire often meant the difference between survival and slaughter. Soldiers begged, borrowed, or outright stole extra BARs whenever they could to counter German firepower advantages. Against Japanese banzai charges in the Pacific, the BAR's automatic fire was often the only thing that stopped human wave assaults from overrunning defensive positions. Marines understood this viscerally. They increased BAR allocation from 513 per division in 1943 to 867 per division by 1945. They reorganized 13-man squads into 3 fire teams, each carrying its own BAR. Tropical conditions brought their own particular hell. The gas cylinder, never upgraded to stainless steel, rusted solid from corrosive-primed M2 ammunition if you didn't strip and clean it daily. Daily, in combat conditions where daily was a luxury few soldiers could afford.
Wooden stocks rotted in the humidity, leading to the 1942 introduction of plastic buttstock made by Firestone rubber. And the 20-round magazine remained a constant tactical headache. At the BAR's rate of fire, 20 rounds lasted roughly 2 to 4 seconds of sustained shooting, constant reloads, constant vulnerability during those few seconds when you're changing magazines. Meanwhile, German belt-fed guns could keep firing for 250 rounds or more without stopping.
World War II ended in 1945. The BAR stayed in service. Korea came in 1950. The BAR was still there, still the primary squad automatic weapon, still getting men killed who carried it because enemy forces still knew exactly what target to prioritize. Some sources suggest BARs were still being used in the early Vietnam years by soldiers who valued its firepower over newer options. The psychological comfort of a proven weapon that hit hard and didn't quit. Better the devil you know than some newfangled machine gun that might fail when you need it most. The M60 machine gun was formally adopted in 1957 as the eventual replacement. By then, the BAR's limitations had finally, irrevocably caught up with it. The fixed barrel that couldn't be swapped during sustained fire, the 20-round magazine that emptied in seconds, the nearly 20 pounds of weight that exhausted even strong men during long patrols, the incompatibility with the new NATO standard 7.62 by 51 mm cartridge that was replacing the 30-06. So a weapon designed for walking fire in the trenches of 1918 finally retired after serving through Korea in a role completely different from what John Moses Browning had ever imagined. It took the Army nearly 40 years to let it go. Epilogue: The Weight of Legacy. The Browning automatic rifle story is one of contradictions. A weapon so effective it terrified enemies. So effective it became a death sentence for the men who carried it. Designed for mobile assault, but turned into a static defensive weapon. Light enough for one man to carry, but too heavy to carry comfortably. Automatic, but not really a machine gun. A rifle, but not really a rifle. John Moses Browning created something that worked exactly as he intended for the specific tactical problem of 1918. Walking fire, mobile suppression, automatic firepower that could advance with assault troops. In that role, it was revolutionary. But the Army spent 2 decades trying to turn it into something else, a light machine gun to compete with weapons specifically designed for that purpose. They added weight, removed the semi-automatic fire that made it so versatile, introduced mechanisms that jammed under field conditions, and refused upgrades that would have actually improved performance. And still, soldiers made it work. They stripped off the improvements and used it the way Browning built it. They carried it through hedgerows and jungles, across islands and mountains, into situations far beyond its original design parameters. They kept using it decades after better options existed, because sometimes the weapon you know how to use is more valuable than the weapon that's theoretically superior.
The 30-minute statistic, that estimated life expectancy for BAR gunners, wasn't because the weapon was unreliable. It was because the weapon was so reliable, so effective, so crucial to squad-level tactics that every enemy soldier knew the tactical imperative: kill the man with the BAR first. Between 1918 and the late 1950s, the BAR served in 3 wars, terrorized 2 generations of enemies, became the favorite tool of America's most violent criminals during Prohibition, and earned a reputation that outlived its actual military service by decades. Men like de Glopper, Watson, and Schauer used it to accomplish things that shouldn't have been possible. They knew the risk. They carried it anyway. They fired it from the hip while advancing under fire, because that's what Browning designed it to do. And when the time came to make the impossible choice, their lives versus their squad's survival,
They already knew which way that calculation went. That 30-minute clock started ticking the moment you picked up the weapon, but for 30 minutes, you were the most dangerous man in your squad. You were the difference between suppressing the enemy and getting suppressed, between holding ground and losing it, between your squad making it home and your squad dying in a ditch. 30 minutes might not sound like much, but in combat, 30 minutes is a lifetime, even when it was the last lifetime you'd ever have.